So the next presentation we're going mm, to reunite with, I'd say, is will be made by Meijia Ling and Matthew Spencer. The topic is changing ourselves to save the planet. I was really impressed by reading the abstract as how the uh, contemplative way we reproduce our own reactions can reframe the reality itself, as the methods are given in the abstract are wider than the exact forms themselves. So that would be an impressive talk. Meijia Ling is a poet and translator and a mindfulness teacher. And this sort of, I guess, experience is just, from my point of view, perfectly linked with the material that Matthew is giving. It's the developing the structures of how we actually observe the reality through philosophical methods. So we're happy to, I guess we all are happy to have you here, and here is your word.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Matthew, I think, are you happy to go ahead?
Yeah, I can start. That's no problem. So I'm just going to share the screen. Okay, so just dropping in really here. I think this presentation has a couple of aspects to it, which I probably should make clear at the outset so that people know what they're looking for. There is actually going to be a kind of standard philosophical claim. So those of you who are interested in that side of things, I hope that what I say will bear out the possibility anyway, if not the absolute truth of that. And the other thing to say is that the basic claim is about the non-linear. So what we've got here in front of us is a picture, probably those of you guys who live in Athens will recognize it fairly readily. This is the Panathinaikos Stadium. So this was built originally in 330 before the Common Era, and then it was refreshed in marble in the late 2nd century of our era, so Common Era. And I think it's usually used nowadays for a variety of sports, but back in the day, the purpose was horse racing. So you can see how the structure would fit that. But the reason that I start with this is that this was the most important Athenian games. So they were local games, but they did actually have some athletes coming from wider afield. So there would have been athletes from other city-states. But associated with the games, there was a very important procession. And I've actually got a map of this. So if we go down here, there was this procession which ended up at the Acropolis. So you see on the left-hand side that you'd enter the temple complex from the western side of the city. And if you've been up there, you'll understand how you see the city laid out beneath you. And the procession would go through, passing round the back to the Parthenon, which is the large temple, which we all have from our postcards. But this procession is extremely important in Athenian culture. It represents a chance for the state, for the city to come together and experience sights and sounds. And in going on this procession, then it culminates in a kind of ritual depositing of the robe on Athene, the goddess of wisdom. But I'm really interested in the kind of everyday experience of this, so that people are actually participating, they're going to an event, they don't know exactly what's going to happen. So it's quite non-linear. Of course, there are ritual elements which are predictable, which might be seen as linear, but this basic contrast of the kind of, you don't know when you go to the festival how it's going to play out and what kind of sights and sounds you're going to see. This is something that mirrors our own experience on this journey through life. So if you're into a particular organized religion, you'll understand how this feature of non-linearity is part of the experience. And what's important about that is that this idea of non-linearity is really central to the Greek philosophical project. And this may surprise for the reason that we tend to think of Greek philosophy as being about the linear, the logical, the principle of non-contradiction, and so on. So with that in mind, I have actually got a claim which I'd like to outline at the beginning, excuse me, so that you can see what you're looking for as we go. Okay, so the idea here is that any ethical problem, and that must include the climate. So climate change, if that is an ethical problem, and of course there are going to be those who think that climate change is not an ethical problem. And I want to take account of that alternative view and what I've got to say. But if it is an ethical problem, then at least according to the central philosophical voices of Plato and Aristotle, we're only going to be able to handle climate change, or indeed any other ethical matter, by attending to the non-linear dimension. And in Greek philosophy, as in other cultural traditions, which I'm not going to forget about, the non-linear aspects of ethics do include meditation and contemplation. So however carefully phrased that has been, that is the basic idea, that we can only get to an ethical resolution by bringing in the non-linear. And I want to explain some practical ways in which this is actually indicated. So there's some hard and fast scientific style evidence. Okay, so that's the basic project. I think the next thing to say is that we're going to go on to the central problem that I want to focus on. This is the problem of peer pressure. So if I bring up this slide here. Okay, so here we have an experiment that was quite famous in social psychology. This was done in the 50s by a researcher called Solomon Asch. The idea here is that you're given two cards and you've got the reference line on the left, and you've got to then say out loud in front of a group whether you think that the longer line is A or C. So this seems fairly intuitive. It doesn't seem very difficult. But what happens is that the experimenter set up a situation in which before you give your answer, there are going to be three other people, all of whom are actors. So they've already been pre-prepared with their line, but they are going to say what they think the longer line is. And the trick here is that 3 seems to be the magic number. So if you do it with more than 3 confederates, with more than 3 actors, people start to work out what's going on and don't follow the crowd. But if you get the number approximately right, and you have 3 people that are coming before the naive subject, so that before the person who's being tested, then that person is going to be under extreme pressure to follow on from what the others in the room have already said. And lo and behold, the answer here is that when asked which is the longer line, you can also do it with shorter, but when asked which is the longer line, people say C. And so when it gets around to you sitting in the hot seat, in the experimental subject position, you then are asked to say which is the longer line, and you're under pressure to say C along with everybody else. And you can see the video of this. People go through various facial contortions when they try to work out whether they really can say what they don't believe. But there is a statistically significant finding that people will tend to go for the wrong answer, even though they don't themselves believe it to be the right answer. So this is a known problem, and there have been various elegant variations of this basic experiment, and they get increasingly ethical. So another variation is that you have people sitting in a room where they're filling out a form, and at a certain point, smoke starts coming in under the door. And at this point, the question is whether the subject, who's the only person who's actually being tested, will get up and investigate the smoke or not. And yes, it seems that if other people in the room are passively sitting there unconcerned, then the pressure is on the person to not investigate. And the third variation is where you might have something that's more obviously ethical. So something like a researcher comes in and introduces themselves and guides you to a chair, and then they disappear into a cupboard while you're doing the experiment. So you're filling out your form, which is not, of course, the purpose of the experiment, but you're filling out your form, and then you hear a loud crash in the neighboring joining room. The question is whether you go and investigate to see if the person's all right. And again, here, if there has been substantial peer pressure building up, then there's significant tendency for people to not actually investigate. Of course, if there's no confederates, if the person is alone in the room, then in all these three cases, they give the answer that they would naturally gravitate to. So they give the right answer for C, they do investigate the smoke, and then they go and check if the person is right in the next one. And the question here is how we handle this problem. If it comes to climate change and we really are supposed to actually now do something, or indeed if you want to see this as climate change as a hoax or as something that is simply a question of giving the wrong answer, I mean, those options are open. But for those who are interested in how you might get people actually doing more pro-social climate-oriented practices, the obvious answer in our day and age is to go for something called a nudge. And it's this that I'm going to be opposing centrally. So nudges, how do they work? We have an image here, I think, above of this. So now this is actually not a fly, it's actually a bee. But the significance of the bee or fly image, it interchanges, is that this has been used effectively in an airport which is quite well known in Amsterdam, so Schiphol Airport. This is featured in a book on nudge theory. So most of everything I've said so far is completely unoriginal. I can give you the references to where all these arguments come from. But basically the idea behind nudge theory is that to get people aiming in a bathroom at the right spot, that they won't create a lot of mess, this is in the men's toilet, you simply put this image of the fly on enamel engraved on the urinal. And lo and behold, according to which statistic you follow, this may actually reduce cleaning bills by either 50 or 80%. I think the more reliable figure is probably the 50%. So this is a nudge, and what's significant for us here today is that nudges work by actually giving the person that you're trying to nudge a different goal than the one. So as the person running the facility, your goal is to keep a clean bathroom. You give your clients another nudge, which gets them doing something else. And I'm going to suggest that this is actually a problem in terms of the philosophical approach to human agency, that if human agency doesn't go all the way down, as it were, it's not actually fully conscious, then it's not the most desirable form of human agency. And therefore, a better idea is to have some kind of solution which actually honors the inner decision-making process of the person, rather than simply manipulate them into doing something that they may or may not want to do. I mean, of course, people may want to have a clean bathroom ultimately, but they are still being nudged. So the alternative to nudge theory is essentially the contemplative approach. And there are some hard and fast results on this. So if we go down to past Socrates, back down to these guys here. Okay, so this is a sort of representation of mindfulness. This is a modern practice, not entirely uncontroversial, both for Buddhists and for secularists. So there's a lot to be said about that. But the bottom line here is that it turns out that with the peer pressure phenomenon, you can actually show that if you line people up in a situation where, I think the situation chosen was that you are entering a waiting room as part of the experiment. In the waiting room, there's one seat left. The question is, do you sit there? So most people went and sat in the seat, but then they are surrounded by a load of other people who are simply checking their phones or otherwise passively disengaged from the wider scene. And at this point, somebody comes down the corridor who obviously needs some assistance in terms of needing a seat. They're on crutches, they look like they're struggling. So the question is whether the subject gets up, leaves their seat and offers it to the person who's just arriving. And this finding here was that if you have been through the 8-week standard mindfulness training course, then you are significantly likely to offer your seat, whereas against the control group, people were not so likely under the effects of peer pressure, which we saw. Okay, so my proposal is that it might be better to have a contemplative stance, a contemplative approach to the problem of the climate, or indeed to any other ethical problem. Now, why is that a good idea? Well, at this point, we might think, well, okay, so this is argued in a lot of traditions. In Buddhism, there's a lot of evidence that the tradition sees even something as apparently non-ethical as mindfulness as a profoundly ethical approach, that in fact it's said in some of the early suttas that if you adopt a mindfulness practice, that then you will achieve enlightenment, and with enlightenment comes all of the ethical flourishing that you'd expect. So people who are sufficiently compassionate can get there, according to one text, simply by following mindfulness instructions. So it's not really fair for people to criticize modern mindfulness as unethical. There are resources in the ancient perspectives which suggest that it's fundamentally ethical, but of course it doesn't look ethical to a kind of post-enlightenment, later Western perspective, where we expect to divide up life into obviously ethical matters and not so obviously ethical matters. But contemplation is argued to be ethical in Buddhism. But where does that leave us in terms of other traditions? And I think it's here that the surprising aspect of the Greek proposal comes to the fore. So if we go back to the Panathenaic procession, we see that this image of the thing I asked you to kind of imagine earlier. So you're going up to the Temple of Athena, you're perhaps a visiting dignitary who's been invited to Athens specially for the event. You're taking in the sights and sounds, you have an interesting day. And when you get back to the state that you maybe came from, so let's say you're going back to Corinth, you've got to write a report now on what you saw at the festival. And this account of a kind of journey would in Greek have exactly the same root as the words that we get our word theory from. So theoria is the word for contemplation or spectating. And I think the most helpful image here to think of is probably the spectator at the theatre who takes in the sights and sounds. They are actively engaged, but there is a certain distance, a certain passivity as well in their experience. So this seems to be how the Greeks understood the contemplative stance. And the signal fact that I wanted to introduce before we go on to the major part of this presentation is to say that, in fact, the image of philosophy for both Plato and Aristotle includes this act or action or stance of theoria. They don't cash it out. There's not a lot of evidence as to what precisely they meant. And we have to kind of reconstruct this from different traditional perspectives. So one idea that was quite popular later on was the sort of Neoplatonist idea that the contemplative stance might involve certain practices that accompany the journey of the soul through life. As obviously this is important in Christianity as well, it gets taken into a distinction between meditation and contemplation. But you can use this basic idea in a completely secular way. And so it's a kind of rich idea that, like the best philosophies, makes room for lots of different human experiences and doesn't adjudicate between them. It basically reserves the category, the contemplative stance, as being absolutely fundamental, let's say ethically fundamental. It is required that you are a contemplative in some sense. So I just add a final couple of thoughts about this to be a bit more historicist about it. What would a contemplative stance be for Plato, or for Aristotle? And they don't seem to reference systematic practices of the kind that later classical tradition offers. So there's no reference to particular exercises that you should do. But we might still think that those exercises fit the basic structure of what they're saying, that you cannot solve an ethical problem just by being linear. Other experiences such as love, such as things in life which are more chaotic, seem to fall under the remit of what creates ethical flourishing in Plato. And so for that reason, we might think of the theoric journey or the theoretic journey as actually involving things which are not only non-linear, but slightly more random. And that's it really. That's just basically an approach that would suggest that we're not going to solve the ethical conundrums in front of us unless we step back and adopt a different stance than the one that is the direction of travel at the moment with linear nudge and often AI-based solutions. Okay, that's it, Meijia. That's all I have to say. So over to you, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matthew. I just share my screen as well.
Take off my share.
Yeah, so my part of this is going to be a bit more experiential. So sort of what Matthew was talking about, but taking you on that journey, on that pilgrimage, and you can take it however you want. And actually, I was thinking, because we've been sitting here talking for quite a long time and listening, maybe there's like something we can do right now. I can't see you, but like you can join me if you want to. Just sort of like maybe rub your hands together, maybe shake, and then just take a few nice long deep breaths. And just bringing the hands up and then down, towards the belly. And this is just to sort of ground ourselves back down from the head to our body. And that's going to be sort of an essential part of this part of the presentation. Okay. So as you're listening to this, maybe sense your feet on the ground, and could even sort of imagine yourself. This is an image, by the way, that I took sort of close to home to kind of give you an idea of where I live, and it's a very green, beautiful place and full of, you know, lush nature. And so I'm very, very appreciative of being in a place like this. And you can use the image to sort of guide your own. I mean, it's even better if we're outside and not, you know, looking at our screens. But if you're looking at this image, you can sort of, as you're listening, just imagine yourself being like the tree with your feet rooted into the ground, energy going into the ground, touching base and linking in with what's around, beneath you, what's around you, and what's above you. Yeah, so sort of what brings me to this question of contemplation and climate matters is really a progression in my own practice about how to embody, you know, how to embody my own contemplations and my own inner journey. What is called for as an action, as actions in the world, right? And this doesn't have to be sort of the only action. It's just what kind of got me here in questioning, like the nature of what life is. And I think that a big part of my journey was looking at what I'm not. So on the sort of the transcendent aspect of like, okay, I'm not the, you know, by meditating and coming back to myself, I'm not the body per se that's changing, shifting, gets ill and experiences all of these things. I'm not my thoughts that comes and goes, and I can be aware of my thoughts. I'm not all the labels, all the things that people put on me. And in going through this process of like a negation, finding what I am in essence, and at any point when I start to label that, or when I start to concretize that, that's not it, right? Because and then in the next moment the experience changes, but throughout the experience there's something that's aware of all my experience. And if I'm not aware, then I'm not really there. So for a long time, that was sort of my, that was my inquiry. Was like the essential nature of things, like transcending beyond what's here, and I think, and now my sort of interest is primarily in how that's embodied, is instead of the I'm not this, it's the I am this, and I am this, and I am this, is sort of like coming back into being with whatever whatever is here. So the so recognizing once more, and I think we had kind of covered this yesterday as well in some of the conversations about Zen, the mountain. It was a mountain, it wasn't a mountain, it was a mountain, and the sort of the quantifiable difference there. It's like in the feeling, in the way in which the level of intimacy that you feel. So before, and I'm still in this journey, and I feel like part of it, the transcendent side might never be touched by things that are shifting and changing, and it's always present. But the relative side, maybe the immanent, the intimate side, that's always sort of that's where all the humanness and the rawness of the what's happening with the world, what's happening with the climate, that's and what's happening in our relationships and whatever, all the life difficulties, all of that is like, for me, that's like an ongoing growth and ongoing journey, ongoing learning, but I guess the quality of being just that little bit more sort of more and more able to hold whatever is happening without having to shy away, more and more able to kind of be with whatever is happening, not to hold the pain and the grief, and also to experience joy and to experience love. That capacity increases as with be kind of alongside being more and more grounded in who I really am. So this then sort of moves me on to sort of like what's happening in the world. And like, I don't read the news very much, so when I was preparing for this presentation, I kind of didn't expect to find things that were going to be so recent. So when I typed in like I've been in conferences recently about the climate change, climate issues, and people talking about how just how much we're already in it, and how much the number of catastrophic sort of climatic events are happening already. Like, that's so unusual if you look at previous data, and that it's accelerating because of these feedback loops. But I was still kind of shocked when I typed in flooding, and it was like, oh, yesterday's news about Germany, and then heat waves, and then and it was all just like literally from a day or two ago. So I guess I'm not going to go too much into sort of giving you, and there's so much sort of information on what is happening in different parts of the world, and I guess what I'd like to do is more, as you look at this, or as you think of your own, something that's close to home, if you are seeing, experiencing the impacts of a changing climate, whatever the cause, right? Or the impact of humans being disconnected from nature, and the suffering of that, right? The suffering of just not feeling we're part of, the mentality of not feeling like we're part of nature, and therefore we can keep extracting and being so detached from it that we don't feel the way in which it moves naturally, the way to restore itself, right? And that we are part of that our healing abilities, the way our cells grow, the way we're composed of inside our own bodies, the intelligence that's flowing through us is part and parcel of the nature that's here. And so I think what would be really nice is if you just either look at these images or take some time to just think of something that speaks to you on this topic, whether you've experienced something recently or and we'll just pause for maybe like 3 breaths, and it would be really good if any of you want to type in sort of any comments or like how you're feeling. How are you feeling when you see that there's the let's just say the possibility that we're in the 6th mass extinction, and that as humans we've already taken over. I think it's something like 99% of mammal biomass on land is domesticated, and only 1% is wildlife. And how do you feel when you hear news about the coral reefs that are bleaching and dying, and the rapid rate in which we're losing the rainforests? So again, I don't think I couldn't figure this out before. Can I see? Oh yes, I can see on the chat. Yeah, so Matthew saying loss. And there doesn't have to be sort of anything immediate, or it and yes, Hans is saying rage. Yeah. Heartache. Yeah. And it's just so nice to kind of, we go through our own process, and often that can feel quite lonely, and especially when we're sort of met with, potentially like something so huge, right? And so in our everyday lives, it's like we just get information overload, and there's no space to really process it. So we just shut it off and continue. So yeah, just, and Sharon saying visibility. Or Kieran, sorry. Visibility. Yeah. So this is a picture of a group of us sort of quite local women gathered together in a forest to sort of contemplate and sing. Actually, it was part of a singing workshop as well as a meditation and sort of healing workshop. And I think there's something really important about not not seeing the spiritual, the contemplative journey as just solitary, and I think even the image of the Buddha or something on the altar is just this one thing, and maybe enlightenment is like a self-actualization individual sort of thing, even if the individual dissolves. I think in practice, especially, and I hope you felt a little bit of that collective energy, when we're reading everyone's comments, is that we're so much a part of each other. Like we're so, our lives are dependent upon the reflections and the mirroring and the of each other. And when we don't have that, when babies, you see experiments where I think it's called the still face experiments, where mums don't reflect back, and babies get totally distraught. So even at such a young age, like just the way in which our inner lives and our outer lives are so interwoven and so connected, I think that the practice as well, and diving in deeper to sort of resolve, to help each other be solid when dealing with any kind of disaster, personal, collective, having that collective solidarity and trust and the space for that is really important. So with that, I'd just like to thank the Chaosmos hands and other organizers for bringing everyone together, and be happy to have questions and dialogue and open it up.